Hi, and welcome to Hull & Hull TV. I'm Suzana Popovic-Montag, the managing partner of Hull & Hull, and I'm very pleased to be joined today by Jennifer Hartman and Ian Hull. Jen is a medical legal consultant and a frequent blogger at Hull & Hull, so you'll be able to put a face to a name now to those of you watching. And she's also a frequent writer about traumatic brain injuries. Ian is our co-founding partner of our firm and a great colleague of mine. Today we're going to talk about brain injuries and mental capacity. And Ian, you and I deal with these issues on a daily basis from a legal perspective, and so it's very nice to have Jennifer here to talk about it from an emotional and a personal perspective. Ian, in your practice, how do these issues tend to arise?
We deal with, in our practice, the end game and, so to speak, the financial side only. We don't deal with the tremendous emotional side, the complete change in the whole family dynamic, and obviously the personal struggles that people who have suffered brain injuries. What we get charged with is the obligation to sit down and try to figure out how these individuals are going to be managed financially for what can be an extended period of time. When an injury occurs, it might be 50 years that they suffer with the injury. It might be 2 years. So our work is tied to how to financially set the stage for the kinds of expected legal and personal costs that are going to be attached to the injury so that damages and calculations can be made. But we don't deal with the person. Mm-hmm. And we're dealing with this all on paper. So it's fascinating to hear from Jen on some of the issues that we're going to explore in terms of the impact of the brain injury itself.
Mm-hmm. Just picking up on what Ian was saying, I think brain injuries have become more of a water cooler conversation these days. And I think that's really come out of the sports world predominantly. And, not necessarily because brain injuries are occurring more frequently in sports, but because the level of awareness is so significantly increased in the public eye. And when I sort of look back through recent years, the one case that comes to mind is that of Sidney Crosby. And if you'll recall, and I'm sure you're a big hockey fan, Sidney was playing in the Winter Classic in January 2011 and sustained a concussion. And concussion's really just a lay term for a brain injury. And we really need to sort of shift the vernacular from concussion to brain injury to give it the appropriate context. So he sustained a brain injury. 4 days later, he was back out on the ice again and sustained a second head injury. And that second head injury, being so close to the first one, ended up sidelining Sidney for a period of 11 months, during which time he had to go through extensive rehab to be able to return to play. When he did return to play in November 2011, he only lasted for 8 games before his symptoms returned, and they returned in spades, and he was sidelined again until March 2012. So what the league did subsequent to the 2 concussions was implement a concussion protocol, which assesses a player, pulls them off the ice, and there's a very prescribed protocol for returning them to play. But Sidney was a great example, as I said, of people using the term concussion and really engaging in a conversation and seeing that there is an impact to these brain injuries.
And Jen, you write on this topic all the time. Would you say that these kinds of injuries happen frequently in pro sports?
Well, we've got 4 professional major leagues in North America. We've got NHL, NFL, NBA, and the MLB. And the head injuries predominantly occur in the NFL. So I'll talk a little bit about the statistics around that. So they find that 60% of NFL players have sustained at least one brain injury in the course of their career. So that's a lot. In the 2012-2013 NFL season, there were 160 players who were sidelined due to incurring a brain injury. And some of them, Wes Welker is a perfect example, were sustaining 2, 3, 4 over the course of the season. So these are not insignificant numbers, and something that we need to keep in mind as well. Some of these are not, go to a dark room, lie down, hopefully return to play a few days later or a few weeks later. Each year in the United States, we see a handful of incidents on the field or on the ice that are catastrophic. So either the athlete is unable to recover to their former self, or the events are actually fatal. So they're not insignificant medical events that we're talking about here.
And I think, from our perspective, when we're dealing with clients, and there are obviously situations where we meet with clients who aren't in the scenario where I was talking about giving an opinion on financial calculations, that they're coming to get advice, and they have suffered the brain injury. And we've talked about this in past episodes with other guests as well, that, we have to be careful that just because they have a brain injury, that does not necessarily mean they don't have capacity. And the extent of the brain injury, it's hard for lawyers to analyze that meaningfully and to determine, even with proper questioning and taking the time with your client, to determine, is the brain injury going to affect the cognition to the level that they can't make a will or that they can't do a new power of attorney.
And Ian's very correct in that assumption that there's no sort of formula that can be applied. If someone's incurred a brain injury, your brain is our body's central processing unit, for lack of a better phrase. And every area of your brain is in charge of a different task. So what happens when you incur a brain injury is very much dependent not only on the severity of the injury, but as well the geography of the injury. And a perfect example of that is Congresswoman Gabrielle Giffords when she was shot at point blank range. Because the trajectory of the bullet remained on one hemisphere of her brain, she was able to survive. Had that crossed from one hemisphere into the other, it would have almost definitely been a fatal event. But the brain has a remarkable ability to heal itself when the injury is confined to one lobe of the brain or one hemisphere of the brain.
Well, from my perspective, I think there's an opportunity here for us as lawyers to make sure that we are encouraging our clients to assess their own abilities when they're coming to see us in situations where they've had, and I really appreciate that comment about concussion versus brain injury. I mean, they've had a brain injury, and if we as lawyers are alerted to these issues and understand better that, at the end of the day, this isn't a fatal blow to capacity, but it may be situational, and it may be that I can't get instructions from that individual for a period of time where recovery needs to be done, and then it's not a permanent brain injury, but it is something that they can come back from, and then I can start talking about how they're going to deal with estate planning. And it's not always young people. I mean, it can be an elderly client who's fallen and hit their head, significant injury in their head, and we don't have to write them off as individuals who can never give capacity, have capacity or give instructions.
I think that's a really good point, and having these kinds of discussions are important to raise the issues, the awareness to people who are dealing with individuals on a regular basis. Mm-hmm. So thank you very much for joining us, Jen, and thank you, Ian, and thank you to those of you watching Hull & Hull TV.